Imagine for a second that you're sitting at a quiet cafe and you overhear a conversation at the next table. Two people are arguing about a bridge that just collapsed. One person is citing engineering reports about structural fatigue and salt corrosion. The other person looks them dead in the eye and says, that bridge didn't collapse because of physics. It collapsed because the government wants to control where we travel. You wait for the punchline, but it never comes. They aren't joking. In fact, they're getting angry. This isn't just a weird anecdote from a coffee shop. It's a snapshot of a much larger, much darker civilizational verdict that's playing out right now in early 2026. We've reached a point where the core consensus on what constitutes a fact hasn't just been challenged, it's been declared brain dead. We are witnessing the twilight of objective truth in the West, replaced by a kind of cognitive tribalism where every statistic is a weapon and every scientific law is just an opinion from the wrong political camp. But while one side of the world is paralyzed by this algorithmic anarchy, unable to agree on the color of the sky, another model is emerging. It's a model that doesn't care about your truth or my truth. It only cares about the hard, cold logic of the engineer. While the West is trapped in a loop of identity politics and rhetorical maneuvers, the East is building a civilizational immunity system, a technocracy designed to treat information hygiene like a public health crisis. We are entering an era where sovereignty isn't just about borders or armies anymore, it's about cognitive sovereignty. It's a brutal competition to see who can still distinguish signal from noise before the system functionally degrades into collective self-sabotage. Today, we're looking at the collapse of the Western mind and the rise of the machine state, and why, in a world where no one can agree on the facts, the only thing left that matters is raw technical efficiency. Okay, wow, that's a lot to take in. Let's try to unpack this, because the sources we compiled for this deep dive, they paint a really stark picture.
They really do.
They're talking about a civilizational verdict being rendered in real time. It's essentially a brutal competition to see which governing model can still do things.
Right. Can you actually execute?
And this contest, it's defined by three major fault lines. First, just the raw efficiency of building things. Can you still manage large, complex physical projects?
Like that bridge.
Exactly. Second, the system you have for rewarding talent and competency, who gets to lead. And third, and this feels like the big one, the defense of the collective mind itself. Can you even maintain a shared reality anymore?
And that's the core argument here, isn't it? The sources are saying that the West is suffering from this fundamental cognitive breakdown.
And that failure is now showing up physically, institutionally.
Exactly. I mean, what we're looking at isn't just political instability, it's the functional degradation of the entire governing model that, basically defined modernity for a century.
So that bridge collapse from the opening, that's not just a political disagreement.
No, it's what the sources call the cognitive brain death of a system. A system that used to depend completely on a shared understanding of industrial facts. That consensus on verifiable stuff, the boring things you need to run a power grid or design a vaccine is, well, the sources say it's now defunct in the West.
Okay, let's start right there with that breakdown. This twilight effect, this algorithmic anarchy. Because if you can't agree on what caused the bridge to collapse physics or a government conspiracy, then you can't do anything.
You can't rationally allocate resources to fix it or prevent the next one.
The whole prerequisite for democratic deliberation,
It fails. It's more than a failure, though. It feels more like an active consumption of shared reality. And this crisis, it's being accelerated by the very structure of the modern internet, specifically what's being termed algorithmic governance.
Wielded by the big Silicon Valley platform.
Right. And these platforms are not neutral public squares. They're not. They are, in the terminology of our sources, agents of cognitive entropy.
Cognitive entropy. We need to expand on that. How does the core profit model of these tech giants actively, work against a shared reality?
It's disturbingly simple. Their whole economic model is tied to maximizing your engagement, your attention. Yeah. And nothing, absolutely nothing, drives engagement better than outrage and emotional escalation.
They've perfected the manufacturing of ideological extremism.
That's the perfect way to put it. If moderate voices or, boring verifiable facts reduce the time you spend scrolling, the algorithm will just bury them. The profit model is directly mathematically linked to pushing people toward polarized content that affirms their identity and just generates maximum emotional heat.
So instead of a marketplace of ideas, what we actually have is this highly personalized feedback loop. And it's designed to make you angrier and more certain that your side is the only side.
Precisely. And this creates what the sources call a perpetual state of cognitive civil war. Truth is no longer a shared external marker. It just dissolves into this infinite loop of emotionally charged, personalized content that validates whatever you already believe.
So the functional outcome is that in the West, fact has become a disposable accessory to identity.
A disposable accessory. I like that. Your identity determines your facts, whether that's about climate science, public health, or, the structural integrity of a bridge. And that is the death of industrial consensus.
And if the very basis of reality is fractured, then all the systems that rely on that consensus, like, say, hiring the most qualified people to build things, they have to start suffering.
Of course.
Our sources connect this cognitive collapse directly to what they call the tyranny of mediocrity, and it's driven by something described as educational Darwinism in reverse.
Yeah, this is one of the most sobering claims in the whole body of material we looked at. Educational Darwinism in reverse. It basically means that the institutional systems, especially in higher education, large corporations, government bureaucracies, they're becoming actively self-sabotaging.
So
They're replacing scientific rigor, engineering excellence, objective technical capability, and they're swapping it out with a focus on performative compliance and rhetorical maneuvering.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? How does the system actually expel its most capable people?
Well, it happens when you shift the metrics of success. So instead of judging an engineer by the verifiable yield rate of their product, or a scientist by the replicability of their research.
The hard number.
Hard numbers. Instead, they're judged on their ability to navigate really complex identity politics, or use specific rhetorical frameworks, or perform institutional loyalty. The most capable people, the ones who just focus on raw output and technical solutions, they often find themselves frustrated or, systematically expelled from promotion pathways because they just lack the necessary political skills for that new environment.
So you essentially end up with a ruling class that's optimized for rhetorical fluency and navigating internal politics rather than for physical output or demonstrable competence.
Exactly. And if you want to build a functional society, you need your most brilliant engineers running your infrastructure, not your most skilled rhetoricians.
And when that intellectual basis of society collapses shared facts, objective merit, the quality of your leadership has to decline.
It has to.
Right.
And when your leadership is optimized for debate over building, your functional capacity declines. Which brings us right to the institutional manifestation of this failure, structural paralysis.
This paralysis has a name. It was coined by the political scientist Francis Fukuyama, Vetocracy. We have to spend some time on this because it feels like the institutional core of the West's inability to act. What exactly is a vetocracy?
A vetocracy describes a deeply dysfunctional system where no single entity, doesn't matter how politically powerful they are, can acquire enough authority to make decisive changes.
So nobody can get anything done.
The defining characteristic is an excessive ability, or maybe a willingness, to use the veto power, whether it's formal or informal. It's a system built on a fundamental lack of trust, where every stakeholder is empowered to stop a project, but no single entity is truly empowered to start one or finish one effectively.
And the most cited example of this gridlock is the American legislative system. The sources say legislative success has just plummeted from around 7% historically down to 2% today.
That 2% number is terrifying. It really is, especially when you think about the complexity of the challenges we're facing that require sweeping legislation.
It speaks to a profound systemic friction.
It does. Look at the staggering number of formal and informal veto points involved in just passing federal legislation in the U.S. A bill has to navigate multiple committees in the House, then multiple committees in the Senate, then it has to survive the Senate filibuster.
Which lets a minority block everything.
Completely, unless a supermajority can get it through. And even if it gets past all of that, the president has a veto, and finally, the Supreme Court can just strike the law down.
It's an intentionally complex maze designed for stasis. But the sources highlight that this maze isn't just used by politicians. It's aggressively manipulated by powerful economic interests.
And that's the fuel that drives the paralysis. You have to acknowledge the immense power disparity in lobbying. Corporate lobbying is roughly 4 times greater than all other lobbying combined.
4 times.
And even more strikingly, compared specifically to public interest and labor lobbying, the corporate presence is 34 times greater. This massive financial engine is geared toward reinforcing every single one of those veto points.
To prevent change, I mean, it makes sense. Any significant change, environmental regulation, corporate taxes, new financial controls, it all threatens vested interests.
So corporate lobbying exists to make sure those things never get past the legislative maze. They use those veto points to keep the status quo frozen, no matter what society actually needs.
And this isn't just theory. We can see the physical toll it takes, which brings us right back to that bridge collapse scenario and the story of Mr. Chen.
Yes, Mr. Chen's story is a perfect illustration of Vetocracy's real-world cost. He was an engineer who emigrated to a major Western city and was just shocked by the administrative paralysis he saw.
Tell us about that.
Well, being an engineer himself, he observed a situation where a critically needed power grid upgrade, something necessary for the city's stability and its green energy transition, was stalled for almost a decade.
A decade? Why? Was it a technical difficulty?
Not at all. It was stalled because a single neighborhood council, or one legal technicality about zoning, could indefinitely stop the entire project. His assessment was blunt. The West had created a system optimized for obstruction. Administrative friction was the default mode of governance.
That's the physical cost of Vetocracy right there. The paralysis translates directly into unusually high infrastructure and housing costs.
Because if you can't approve and permit necessary infrastructure, housing, bridges, energy grids, the cost of the few things that do get built just skyrockets, and the whole system decays. This institutional failure, this inability to execute, it leads us directly into the third component of this Western disease: how we handle capital.
Right. The West's financial habits haven't just stalled infrastructure. They've fundamentally hollowed out the productive economy. And the term for this is financialization. Let's define that clearly.
Financialization is this structural transformation of the economy, where the values, the motives, the institutions of finance come to dominate industrial life and corporate governance. It's a fundamental shift.
So the economy starts prioritizing making money from money through trading and speculation.
Overproducing tangible goods like cars or machinery or even software. This shift really started gaining momentum back in the 1980s, and it was largely driven by deregulation.
This sounds like a philosophical shift, but the sources we have provide some incredible statistics that show it's not just philosophy. It's a massive reallocation of national wealth away from industry.
The divergence is shocking. I mean, look at the historical role of manufacturing in the U.S. economy. At its peak, manufacturing counted for 40% of all corporate profits and 29% of the nation's jobs.
Okay, so 40% of profits, 29% of jobs.
Now, contrast that with the finance sector today. It captures 40% of corporate profits. The same slice as peak manufacturing, but it employs only about 5% of the nation's jobs.
Wait, hold on. So finance absorbs 40% of the profits, the same as manufacturing once did, but with less than 1/5 of the workforce.
That's it.
That is capital being violently diverted away from the productive sectors.
That is exactly the point. It shows that the engine of the economy, the sector that actually produces things and employs large swaths of the middle class and drives physical innovation, is just being starved of capital, while the financial sector absorbs the bulk of the economic rewards with minimal employment growth.
And it's not just about jobs, it's a disinvestment in the physical future of the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the main mechanism for this disinvestment is what the sources call the buyback trap.
Okay, explain how this short-term profit-seeking works.
So when a corporation earns money, it has a choice. It can invest in R&D, build new factories, hire more people, or it can return that money to shareholders.
And financialized governance overwhelmingly favors the latter.
Overwhelmingly. S&P 500 companies between 2003 and 2012 use a staggering 91% of their earnings for stock buybacks and dividends.
91%. So that means almost none of their profits were reinvested into long-term growth, strategic tech, or improving the industrial base.
It was all about boosting short-term stock prices to enrich shareholders and, executives whose compensation is tied to those stock prices.
It creates this self-reinforcing culture of short-termism. That's the definition of economic decadence, isn't it?
It is. When capital is extracted from the productive economy and just recycled through financial markets for immediate gain, the result is rising inequality, massive wealth concentration, and just generalized economic fragility. By 2020, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio was at 128.1%. This prioritization of debt and financial engineering over patient, productive investment, it signals a deep systemic sickness. And it erodes the capacity to compete industrially on a global scale. The ability to build, to execute, is functionally deadened by these financial priorities.
Okay, so if part I was the diagnosis of the Western disease cognitive chaos, structural paralysis, financial decadence, then part two is the study of the Eastern counter model, a model that explicitly rejects those failures and substitutes them with, as the sources say, the hard logic of the engineer.
It's a completely different mindset.
While the U.S. elite is often described as a lawyerly society blocking everything it can, the sources characterize the East, specifically China, as an engineering state, just building big at breakneck speed.
And that contrast is essential to understanding this whole civilizational verdict idea. It's a contest between the procedural and the physical.
So let's start with the leadership. This concept of the empire of engineers, it's not a metaphor, it's a literal description of who holds power.
Absolutely. The ruling elite since the 1980s has been overwhelmingly dominated by people with technical backgrounds. By 2002, every single one of the 9 members of the Politburo Standing Committee, the nation's highest decision-making body, had engineering training.
The former General Secretary, Hu Jintao, was a hydraulic engineer.
Right, he worked on major dam projects. These are people who fundamentally understand the physics of execution, not just the rhetoric of governance.
And that focus has only intensified. The sources note that post-2022, the current administration, led by a chemical engineer, has deliberately filled key Politburo slots with executives from the country's aerospace and weapons ministries.
Which signals an explicit prioritization of technical management, defense industry expertise, and the ability to run these incredibly complex, coordinated megaprojects. The fundamental bias of the engineering state is clear. New public works are the solution to societal and economic problems. They're the ultimate expression of state capacity.
And the results are, well, they're undeniable, especially when you measure them against the Western struggle to approve a single bridge. Give us some of those staggering statistics on physical output.
Okay, so on infrastructure metrics, China has built an expanse of highways equal to twice the length of the entire U.S. system.
Twice the entire U.S. system.
Twice. Their high-speed rail network is 20 times more extensive than Japan's. And then there's the industrial base, which is just obsessed with production. The global manufacturing stats are staggering. China produces between 1/3 and 1/2 of nearly every manufactured product globally.
From what, steel to solar panels?
From structural steel and container ships to solar panels and advanced electronics. They are executing on a scale the West no longer has the collective will or capacity to match.
This brings us back to Mr. Chen's world, the engineer who emigrated west and just saw administrative chaos. In his native land, the state's legitimacy isn't found in a political process.
No, it's found in the concrete itself. The sources call this physical layer truth. Legitimacy is derived from measurable, hard outcomes.
Right. Citizens don't need to debate if the high-speed rail exists. They can ride it.
They don't need to argue about power throughput. They have reliable electricity. This verifiable yield rate of advanced manufacturing and infrastructure deployment, that is the state's political mandate. The sources call it the propaganda of the deed.
Propaganda of the deed. I like that.
Yeah, the constant construction of new cities and vast infrastructure networks creates this real, tangible pride that acts as a form of political stabilization.
But let's introduce some critical friction here. It's easy to look at those massive numbers, twice the U.S. highways, 20 times Japan's rail, and just feel awe. But the sources do imply this fixation on raw physical output, this pouring of concrete. It might come at a cost.
It's a very real tension.
Are they sacrificing long-term scientific breakthroughs for short-term capacity gains?
That is a fundamental tension the sources identify. The Empire of Engineers model prioritizes applied technology and rapid deployment, getting things done now, over pure basic theoretical research. This is an efficiency contest about execution speed. But, history shows that true civilizational shifts often come from open-ended foundational research that might take decades to commercialize.
So the engineering state is optimized for implementation.
But there's always the question of whether it sacrifices the kind of nonlinear, unpredictable innovation that liberal research environments, despite their current paralysis, sometimes foster.
Okay, so this focus on technical efficiency and verifiable output gets formalized into what's called the Beijing Consensus. And it's presented as a direct, successful alternative to the Washington Consensus model.
Right, the Washington Consensus that emphasized liberal market policies and deregulation. The Beijing Consensus, a term coined by Joshua Cooper Ramo, is fundamentally pragmatic. It prioritizes achieving equitable, peaceful, high-quality growth through national strength and innovation, while rigorously defending national sovereignty, both financial and political.
So it rejects the idea that economic growth has to be paired with immediate, sweeping democratic change.
Exactly. And its pragmatic core is defined by gradualism and trial and error, instead of rapid, massive privatization, so-called shock therapy.
Which is what the Washington Consensus often prescribed in the 90s.
Yes. The Beijing Consensus advocates for incremental reform. Policy is often experimented with at a regional level, assessed using very strict KPIs, key performance indicators, and only then scaled nationally if it's proven effective. It involves a strong pro-development state that directs capital and maintains a tight grip on strategic industries.
Things like finance, transportation, utilities.
The essentials. And Daniel Bell provided a structure for this model, the three-tier model, which describes this political balance between free markets and authoritarian control.
So what are the tiers?
Bell placed democracy at the bottom tier, allowing for localized grassroots elections for village councils. The middle tier is characterized by meritocratic experimentation and policy testing. And the top tier is defined by rigorous meritocracy, where leaders are selected based on credentials, performance, and competency.
It's a blend that allows the government to maintain political stability and long-term planning capability.
Which they view as essential, all while harnessing market forces for economic vitality.
And this model gained significant global traction, didn't it? Especially after 2008 and 2009, when the Western financial system basically faltered.
The contrast was stark. When the Washington Consensus appeared to implode during the financial crisis, the China model maintained dynamic growth. That gave it huge international appeal. Stefan Halper noted that Beijing aggressively exports this template globally, particularly to developing nations.
And their key selling point?
No strings attached gifts and loans. They promise economic growth without demanding politically destabilizing democratic reforms. And that is highly appealing in nations like Sudan or Angola or Zimbabwe, where the Western aid model often comes tied to ideological conditions. It's a compelling alternative for leaders prioritizing stability and growth above everything else.
This entire model is rooted in a meritocracy that seems far more uncompromising than anything the West currently operates. And this is driven by an intellectual movement called the Industrial Party.
Yes. The Industrial Party is a highly influential movement of thinkers and political actors who explicitly support techno-nationalism and economic growth above all else. They reject liberalism, universal human values, and pure free market ideology. Their core belief is that material improvements, advancements in production, technology, state capacity, they transcend ideology.
They sound like political scientists who think like engineers. They don't want to debate theory. They want to execute.
It's a perfect summary. They actively reject what they sometimes call the sentimental parties, debates over identity and process, and they focus instead on objective, measurable performance. They prioritize effectiveness and academic knowledge over political participation.
So this is the application of epistocracy.
Exactly. Rule by the knowledgeable, where competence is seen as the primary source of legitimacy. Frank Fang argued this provides a mandate of merit, where leadership is continually internally tested and rewarded based on verifiable performance data.
Okay, but this concept of epistocracy, rule by the knowledgeable, it's presented in the sources as a form of social justice. How can such a centralized, merit-driven system be seen as just?
Because it offers a clear, objective path for upward mobility, one that's untainted by the subjective, procedural delays and financial gridlock plaguing the West. It promises that if you are capable, if you are productive, if you contribute measurable utility to the state, you will rise.
Which brings us to the personal story of Li.
Yes, let's look at Li's experience because it's a direct contrast to the Vetocracy and financial decadence we were just talking about.
So Li is the daughter of factory workers, a classic example of the kind of intergenerational mobility that has really stalled in many Western economies.
And her entire life, from early schooling through her professional placement, was governed by these uncompromising metrics. She spent her adolescence focused on STEM education, often putting in 16-hour study days. Her path wasn't determined by who her parents knew or which university she went to based on pedigree.
Or her rhetorical skill in a DEI workshop.
Exactly. It was raw data, test scores, verifiable output, technical capability. So she lands a role in an advanced AI lab. Not because she navigated the rhetorical landscape, but because her technical contribution to the state's collective goal, which was measured by strict key performance indicators, was demonstrably superior.
It's ruthlessly efficient.
It's KPI-driven governance applied to human development. The state views human capital as a resource to be optimized for the collective good, And the best way to do that is through objective meritocratic selection. While the pressure is immense, the system offers a promise. Your fate is defined by your capacity, not your connections or your wealth.
The Industrial Party sees the state's approach to solving issues, even complex social challenges, as math exercises.
That's right. Whether it was implementing the one-child policy or the rapid scaling of the zero-COVID strategy, the engineering state views people as measurable aggregates. It prioritizes technical effectiveness and speed to achieve a defined collective goal, and it's unbound by individualist sentiment.
So you have a system that optimizes for maximum collective physical utility, even if it ignores individual procedural rights. The competition, then, isn't just about bridges and trains, it's about a fundamentally different view of what governance is. Which brings us to part 3. Because the functional competition between these two models, the chaotic West and the efficient East, has now transcended the physical realm entirely. We are entering an era where the battlefield is the human mind itself.
Right. The competition has moved beyond cyberspace and information warfare into something the sources call meta-war.
Meta-war.
It's the ultimate domain of conflict, as defined by thinkers like Pichu-Maleka. It's the conceptual leap. It's the total and adaptive conflict designed specifically for controlling narratives, perceptions, attention, and ultimately social cohesion.
It's defined as a metadomain that fundamentally restructures a nation's collective meaning and shared reality.
In simple terms, they're saying the war moved from hacking servers to hacking our brains.
This is truly chilling, because it implies the direct weaponization of science against cognitive function.
That is the core threat. We are talking about the neurocognitive weaponization of conflict. Sources warn of neuroweapons, which can range from psychoactive agents designed to destabilize populations to directed electromagnetic signals aimed at influencing brain function, emotional states, and collective decision-making.
This isn't science fiction.
No, it's a developing domain of strategic research. But the more pervasive current threat isn't some psychoactive agent. It's the everyday infrastructure of the digital age, which has been weaponized by AI-driven disinformation.
So the systems we use for communication have become the primary tools of meta-war.
Precisely. The algorithms that drive social media are optimized for engagement, which, as we established, means they are optimized for outrage and polarization. AI is used to deliver highly personalized content that is tuned specifically to your psychological profile and emotional triggers. This level of micro-targeting allows actors to steer collective perception at scale with previously unimaginable efficiency.
And since engagement, fear, and outrage drive clicks more effectively than nuanced facts, the content that wins is effective content.
Yes. Emotional manipulation is a core component. Effective content, fear, anxiety, hope, outrage, is deliberately used to saturate the media environment. The strategic goal of this is to fracture collective memory and systematically impair public trust in institutions.
Whether it's the government, science, or the media.
All of them. And surveillance capitalism, the monetization of our personal data and behavioral patterns, has already created the detailed psychological profiles necessary to do this, building these emotional propensity profiles that allow actors to exploit ideological vulnerabilities globally. The final goal is clear: degrade social cohesion and undermine the resilience of the target state.
It sounds like the Western system, defined by that algorithmic entropy, is providing the perfect open testing ground for the very warfare designed to destroy it from the inside out.
That's the tragic irony, isn't it? The open, unregulated digital environment created by Western freedom facilitates its own cognitive dissolution. It allows internal factionalism to become a weapon against social cohesion.
So, to counter this total war for the mind, the East has developed a unified defense doctrine. Cognitive sovereignty, what's its fundamental objective?
Cognitive sovereignty is defined as the absolute authority of a nation over its collective perception and its decision-making processes. It's the national defense of a nation's mind space, treating the integrity of collective thought as a critical strategic asset, just like territory or economic resources.
And this mandates state mechanisms for enforcing narrative integrity and media hygiene.
It does. Which brings us to that third narrative anchor, the father in the East observing his son's digital environment. For him, regulation isn't oppression. It's necessary protection.
Right. He saw the polarization and factual chaos of the Western internet and called it debilitating. He described the local regulatory framework, the information shield, as an essential layer of protection for his son's development.
So in the Eastern framework, regulation of the cognitive environment is explicitly redefined as information hygiene engineering. It's a public health measure. The goal is to prevent the collective mind from being infected by what they view as debilitating Western spiritual viruses.
Things like extreme factionalism, identity-driven anti-meritocracy, and anti-scientific posturing.
All of it. So it's not merely censorship, it's the building of a civilizational immunity system designed to maintain stability and prevent the factual collapse that leads to Vetocracy and paralysis.
But this requires a radical acceptance of authority.
It does. Since the Western model proves that citizens, when left to the chaos of algorithmic anarchy, are paralyzed by their inability to agree on facts, the state has to assume a new role. This is the application of legalist logic.
The state must become the ultimate fact definer.
Exactly. It enforces the shared reality and dictates outcomes that maximize collective physical utility, stability, energy throughput, even if it requires suppressing inconvenient truths or pluralistic viewpoints. The ultimate battle, then, is determined by speed and effectiveness. The sources argue that cognitive sovereignty is directly proportional to computational capacity. It is the absolute ability of the national entity to ingest chaos or noise and rapidly produce and deploy effective governance instructions. The signal.
So if your government takes 6 months to analyze a problem and 9 months to debate it, but mine takes 6 hours to analyze and 6 days to implement, I win the competition.
That speed and control are seen as the ticket to civilizational survival in the meta-war era. And to achieve this computational supremacy, Moleka outlines a 5-pillar defense doctrine.
What are the pillars?
It's a proactive systemic defense of the national consciousness. The pillars are anticipation, using AI monitoring to predict narrative shifts. Strategic narrative protection, which is curating and reinforcing official unifying narratives. Coordinated counter-influence, rapidly deploying response teams to debunk harmful foreign narratives. Cognitive recovery, systems for restoring trust in institutions after an attack. And finally, interagency integration, making sure security and information agencies operate seamlessly to manage the information environment.
It's an architecture designed for total control of perception.
Total control.
Okay, so we see the East building this high wall of cognitive sovereignty, but in the West, the counter-ideal remains absolute unbound freedom, even if that freedom leads directly to factual collapse. And the proposed Free Internet Act, the FIA, is a perfect example of this philosophy.
The FIA, which notably originated from a crowdsourcing effort on Reddit, champions the most radical version of the Western digital ideal. Its foundational belief is that users have the right to free speech and to free knowledge. We govern the content of the internet, governments don't.
And it proposes a near-total prohibition of government censorship.
Right, only allowing interference in extreme non-subjective cases like child pornography or financial scams. And its core mechanism for protection is shielding the host platform from liability, pushing all the onus onto the individual uploader.
So the provisions are intentionally designed to make content removal extremely difficult.
Massively difficult. For instance, to prove copyright violation, a key area of friction, the accuser has to prove that the uploader knew they were uploading illegal content and that the content was not protected by fair use. Plus, the accused has to be notified 30 days before any content is taken down. This massive burden of proof makes enforcement nearly impossible.
This radical defense of digital freedom, though, was met with intense criticism from those who saw it as a recipe for disaster.
Oh, absolutely. Critics warned that the FIA was so weak on liability and intellectual property protection that it would instantly revert the internet to a Wild West type situation where copyright litigation would become extremely difficult and platforms would have near total immunity.
It's the ultimate expression of favoring individual, unbounded freedom over structural stability or factual integrity. So if we place these two models side by side, the Western drive for unbound freedom, this algorithmic anarchy that dissolves truth, versus the Eastern disciplined approach, the information shield that enforces a collective reality, we are left with a massive civilizational choice. Has the Western ideal of digital freedom in the age of meta-war become a tool for cognitive self-sabotage?
The sources certainly suggest that the West, constrained by its philosophical commitment to individual freedom, allows the very systems that fuel factual collapse and factionalism to thrive unbound. It fears regulating the cognitive environment more than it fears the resultant collapse of consensus, which, as we've seen, leads to physical paralysis.
While the East?
The East, leveraging legalist logic and epistocracy, operates under the assumption that maximizing collective physical utility and ensuring state survival requires strictly enforcing information hygiene and computational control. And they accept the cost to individual liberties and pluralism. It's a competition between procedural chaos and raw material effectiveness.
What's fascinating here, as we synthesize all these sources, is that the cascade of problems facing the West, this administrative paralysis from Vetocracy, identity-driven anti-meritocracy, factual collapse, they aren't separate events.
No, they're symptoms.
They're symptoms of a systemic, deep-seated failure to distinguish signal from noise, and it's rooted in political decay and financial short-termism.
And in stark contrast, the East has built this civilizational immunity system that relies entirely on technical efficiency, on KPI-driven governance, and on sovereign control of the cognitive environment. They are actively defining reality for the sake of utility and execution, while the West is endlessly debating the definition of reality for the sake of abstract procedure.
So what does this all mean at the end of the day? We are witnessing a brutal efficiency contest. The West believes effective governance must be based on a flawed, paralysis-prone democratic process and abstract values that promote individual freedom, even if that freedom leads to anarchy.
While the East believes effective governance is purely a function of raw, technical efficiency and the sovereign control of the collective mind. The future of sovereignty is computational. It is about who can process reality faster and execute solutions more efficiently.
The sources suggest the ideal outcome would be for China to learn to value pluralism and the legal protection for individuals, the thing the engineering state lacks, while the U.S. recovers the capability to build for its people, the thing the lawyerly society has forgotten.
The competition isn't over which system is inherently better or more moral, but purely which one can acquire the other's missing piece, technical speed or protected freedom, before its own foundational failure leads to collective self-sabotage. And that dynamic defines the civilizational verdict we are currently watching unfold.